Hey there, 8th graders, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating topic: revolutionary ideals, loyalists, women, and African Americans. When we think of the American Revolution, it's super easy to just picture this single, united group of colonists, all marching shoulder to shoulder against the British. But honestly, history is rarely that simple. Actually, scratch that, it's pretty much never that simple. The truth is, the revolution wasn't just this one unified fight for independence. It effectively sparked multiple complex civil wars right here on American soil. Today, we're going to look closely at how the actual wartime choices and that soaring language of liberty really impacted the everyday lives of vastly different groups of people living through this incredibly chaotic time. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The divided republic. 2. Choosing sides, the Loyalists. 3. Women and the war effort. 4. African Americans and freedom. 5. Indigenous nations. And 6. Legacy of the ideals. We're going to use a cause and effect lens to see exactly how the language of the revolution shaped these distinct groups. All right, Section 1. The divided republic, a nation in conflict. So, for a really long time, the overarching historical claim about the American Revolution has basically been that it was a completely united fight for liberty. But the evidence? Well, it paints a very different picture. Now, what's really interesting about this is how explicitly the claim of unity crashes into the actual data. Out of a population of roughly 2.5 million in British America, only about 1/3 committed themselves to the Patriot cause. Another third, they remained fiercely loyal to Great Britain. And that final third were entirely neutral, maybe apathetic, or just trying to survive and go about their daily lives. In places like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, the population was deeply, painfully divided. It was like a giant puzzle where the pieces just didn't fit together perfectly. Moving on to Section 2, Choosing Sides, the Loyalists. Let's do a quick pause check here. I really want you to stop and think about this for a second. If the Patriots were supposedly fighting for liberty, why would everyday colonists, and we're talking everyone from wealthy royal officials down to regular tenant farmers, actively reject the Patriot cause and side with the king? If you guessed it had a lot to do with practical survival, you hit the nail on the head. Loyalism wasn't always about this deep, patriotic love for King George. Far from it. It was often a highly practical, life-or-death wartime choice. Many merchants had extensive business ties to Great Britain, right? They relied on the empire for their livelihoods. Others were simply terrified of mob rule and the sheer instability that a revolution brings. And fascinatingly, in places like New York's Hudson Valley, many tenant farmers became loyalists purely because they deeply resented their patriot landlords. So yeah, it was about local rivalries and economic survival just as much as global politics. And the consequences of those wartime choices? They were absolutely massive. 100,000. During the war, revolutionary state governments passed these confiscation acts, basically seizing the land and property of anyone who refused to take an oath of allegiance to the new states. Because of this, as many as 100,000 loyalists lost literally everything they had and fled. To put that into perspective, that's like a massive college football stadium entirely packing up and leaving for England, the British West Indies, and especially up north to Canada, completely transforming the demographics there. Next up, Section 3, Women and the War Effort. While the men were off fighting, women were left to shoulder immense burdens on the home front. They kept the homesteads running and stepped into incredibly public, totally unprecedented roles. Just listen to this authentic quote from Esther de Burdett Reed. She writes, "The time has arrived to display the same sentiments which animated us at the beginning of the Revolution, when our Republican and laborious hands spun the flax, prepared the linen intended for the use of our soldiers." Reed actually formed the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia, and working alongside groups like the Daughters of Liberty, they actively raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to supply the freezing, starving Continental Army. They were an absolute game changer. Let's shift to Section 4, African Americans and freedom. For Black Americans, the revolutionary ideal of liberty wasn't just some abstract political philosophy about taxes. It meant literally fighting for physical emancipation from enslavement. So, time for our second pause check. Think about this carefully. In a world where the British Empire heavily relied on the transatlantic slave trade, why would the British military suddenly offer freedom to enslaved people in America? Well, here is the immediate reasoning. The British offer of freedom was definitely not a sudden moral awakening against slavery. No way. It was a highly strategic, calculated wartime choice. By offering freedom to those who fled their Patriot captors and joined the British lines, the British Army severely weakened the Patriot economy and simultaneously bolstered their own labor and military forces. It was a tactical move, plain and simple. And this strategy worked on a huge scale. 20,000. That is the staggering number of enslaved people who seized the opportunity, fled their captors, and joined the British cause. Between 10 and 20,000 actually gained their freedom because of the revolution. It's an incredible historical fact. The American Revolution essentially created the largest emancipation event in America until the Civil War. And this brilliantly illustrates the impossible, incredibly high-stakes choices that Black individuals had to navigate to secure their own liberty. On one side, we have Boitrio Brinch, who fought for 5 grueling years in the American Patriot Forces, dodging musket balls in major battles just to finally earn his emancipation. On the other side, we have Boston King, an enslaved man in Charleston who fled a cruel master to join the Loyalists, eventually securing a certificate of freedom from the British. Both men achieved liberty, but through incredibly different, dangerous wartime paths. All right, Section 5, Indigenous Nations in Conflict. Just like African Americans and Loyalists, Native peoples had to carefully navigate this completely chaotic civil war, making strategic alliances to protect their homelands, their cultures, and their autonomy. Powerful nations like the Mohawk and the Creek recognized that the aggressive expansion of American colonists was the single greatest threat to their survival. Leaders like the Mohawk chief Joseph Brant allied with the British, fighting fiercely to stop colonial encroachment. But the tragic reality, their loyalty was entirely betrayed. When the war ended, the British negotiated the Treaty of Paris and handed over massive amounts of supposedly British-owned territory to the United States, territory that in reality belonged to their indigenous allies. Finally, Section 6, Legacy of the Ideals. We've spent some time looking at the cause and effect of these wartime choices. Now, we've got to examine the long-term legacy of the revolution's lofty language of equality against the stark, everyday reality of the new nation it created. Let's do a post-war reality check. Despite the soaring claim in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, the evidence of the new republic paints a completely different picture. The revolution largely reinforced a racial identity where whiteness denoted freedom and power, while blackness was tragically cemented to servile status. Furthermore, despite their absolutely incredible wartime contributions, women remained completely without political rights. And Native American lands? They were continuously and violently seized. Full citizenship in this new republic was essentially restricted to free, white, property-holding males. So the crucial point is this. The myth of a perfectly unified revolution masks a deeply divided, incredibly unequal reality. We started with a divided republic, remember, split right into thirds. We saw how this forced difficult, often dangerous wartime choices upon Loyalists, women, enslaved African Americans, and indigenous nations. And finally, we witnessed the deeply unequal outcomes, where those soaring ideals of liberty and equality fell painfully short for marginalized groups. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. How does understanding the gap between the revolution's high ideals of equality and the gritty, historical reality experienced by these groups help us evaluate American democracy today? Does this founding historical paradox still shape the nation we live in right now? It's something to think about. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the evidence, and I will see you in the next explainer.